And now, AM 650 presents your source for leading-edge news and information on today's hottest products and services. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.
Well, good evening and welcome to Key Pacific's Talk About Strata. I'm Sterling Fox, joined in studio by my co-host Tony Giventu, Executive Director of the Condominium Homeowners Association of British Columbia. Good evening, Tony.
Good evening, Sterling. Hey, we have some great guests with us
We
today.
have a couple of guests from Key Pacific.
We do, of
A
all
first
places.
appearance
Yeah,
from Key
it
Pacific
is
on the Key Pacific show. It's about time, don't you think?
I think it's way over past time. So we have Dan Ahern and Barrett Hansen, and we're going to be talking about the complications that strata councils and the managers and the relationships deal with when it comes to managing rental bylaws, because we have so much misinformation in the industry and so much confusion around how rental bylaws are administered and how they're applied.
Well, Dan and Barrett, welcome to the program. Let's start off, as long as we're talking about rentals in strata environments. Is it a safe thing to say, Dan, for example, that in every strata environment there are some people who are renting?
Oh, yeah. Super common.
Okay.
Yeah, every corporation has to deal with this. Yep.
And what about a group of owners who decide amongst themselves, as a strata council, for example, they don't want any renters in their building? Barrett, what happens then?
Well, there's something that they would have to put before the ownership by a three-quarter vote to implement the rental restriction bylaw.
Okay. But it is possible, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, now if a building creates such a bylaw in which tenants are discouraged, if not forbidden, does that close the door? Tony, is that it? Is it over? Or are there still situations in that no renters building in which renters may appear?
There are always going to be the potential for renters because we have so many exemptions provided under the Act. And frequently, strata corporations don't even know that they have renters in the building. You know, when a building is first sold, a family may buy a unit for their parents. The parents move in and the family own the unit, but the parents are basically living there as family rentals.
Right.
But, you know, frequently no one checks the titles to see who the actual owner is. And the people who are living there will pay the strata fees and the bills and the utilities. They get elected to council. It's surprising how often we get calls at the office about people who've been elected to council who, by the way, they found out they're not even on title. They weren't they were family members. You know, the unit was purchased by the family and, you know, part of estate planning and part of that cycle.
Sure.
And so the Act protects that. The Act gives family members, which are parents or children of you or your spouse, an exemption under the legislation.
So they are allowed, Dan, to not only rent but also serve on strata councils. Is that legal under these exemptions?
Sure. Yes. Yep. And I mean, and two, right now we're dealing with how buildings are set up initially by developers.
Okay.
You know, in recent, with new legislation recently, developers may determine that rentals will always be permitted in that building for virtually an indefinite time. They may have time limits, but we're certainly seeing a lot of 100-year disclosures, right?
In the owner-developer, when they set up the original exemption, the purpose of it is that the owner-developer doesn't predetermine whether it's investors who are buying in these buildings or whether they're resident owners. But what they're doing is they're protecting the rights of investors at the same time. So as an owner-developer, I set it up in such a way, and the big change occurred January 1st, 2010. So now when I look at the rental disclosure statement, it actually says the specific strata lots that are exempt and for how long they're exempt.
Okay.
Right. And as Dan said, they're frequently 100 years, 99 years, 100 years. Prior to 2010, the rental disclosure almost always said indefinite. And nobody knew what that was until we had a court case a few years ago. And indefinite applies only to the first purchaser. So at some point, the first purchaser is not going to extend probably for 99 years. They'll either through estate evolution or through selling the unit, being the first purchaser will expire, and that exemption in that period will terminate essentially.
Okay. Barrett, when we talked earlier, I asked both of you about environments in which there are no renters. There's a preference for no renters. To flip that coin, are there now strata buildings in which there are basically only renters. Each individual unit is owned by someone, but they've been rented out, and the whole building ends up being a rental.
Absolutely, if not the whole building, the majority of it, certainly. And we see that more and more now since Tony mentioned January 1st, 2010.
Right.
When there is this continuous allowance until that specific date to rent out.
Right. So, Dan, one of the things that we always spend a little bit of time on Talk About Strata is addressing the concerns of potential strata owners, people, boomers, for example, who are downsizing out of that big old house in the burbs, looking for something a little more manageable to change their lifestyle in a positive way. So if you're shopping, Dan, for a strata, looking at condos and that sort of thing, we always try to provide good questions for potential buyers to ask. And I suspect how many renters are there in this strata is a really good question to ask.
It is, and it's disclosed in some of the documentation you receive. We call it a Form B. And, there's always this concern and hesitation about buying into a building that has a lot of rentals. I mean, let's make it clear that a lot of tenants are excellent. In fact, probably everyone in this room was a tenant at some point,
Definitely.
Right? And so I don't think investors or tenants are necessarily bad for a building. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a reality of post 2010 with the disclosure or with the disclosures that we have that we're going to have to accept this. So it's important that corporations really embrace tenants. Councils don't look at it as bad. And I think there's a collaboration that's needed between council, management, and the owners in general. There's some excellent tenants, and if you have a very bad tenant, it's easier to rectify the problem than a bad owner. Would you agree?
Oh, I would totally agree with Dan. And it's the philosophy there are no bad pets, just bad pet owners.
Right.
Well, in most cases, there are usually not bad tenants; they're bad landlords.
Okay.
Right. You'll get landlords who don't do screening, who don't actually check up on the history of the tenants that they're taking in. They're desperate for anybody. Mm-hmm. They just plunk them in, and they cause all kinds of problems. They don't think about it. Landlords have big repercussions, though. That's the part that is, eventually the karma that they create through bad tenants comes back to haunt them, and they pay the bills for everything.
Now, these disclosures that Barrett was telling me about, Tony, just a moment or so ago, if you're shopping for a condo, there's a Form B now that you can look at and find out what the situation is in this complex, how many buildings are being rented. Is that only information provided in new buildings, or does any strata for sale anywhere in the province now have to comply with that disclosure?
Form B information certificate or a certificate of disclosure has essentially always been part of our legislation.
Okay.
So one of the complications around a Form B, though, is when it says the total number of rentals, that's not the total number of rentals permitted under the bylaw. That's the total number of rentals. So one of the really daunting tasks that Strata Council and the property manager have to always maintain is a rental inventory. And you have to kind of have your hands on who's renting, who's not renting, who's moved in, who's moved out, and start putting that into a 200 or 300 unit building. And it's a complicated problem to manage.
Right.
So when you look at the Form B, it might say there are currently 37 rentals or 51 rentals. That simply means the strata has a record of those 37 or 51 units that are either rentals under the bylaw, owner-developer exemptions, family exemptions, hardship exemptions. There could be a whole variety, but it's just going to give you one number. The other part of the Form B, though, that is just as important to a buyer is that the strata corporation, and it's usually the property manager who provides this, must attach a copy of the original rental disclosure that was created by the owner-developer to the Form B.
Okay.
And I have to say that I'm actually a bit appalled in the last few weeks of the number of complaints we've had around Form Bs that don't include the rental disclosure. So as a buyer going in, you have no way of knowing what the capacity of the rental disclosure is.
And that's pretty critical information for a buyer, especially at the prices, Dan, that they're asking for accommodations in the Lower Mainland these days.
Yeah, and that may be happening. I mean, that really shouldn't be happening. We're certainly very diligent in providing those disclosures, and you sometimes have to go to the superintendent to receive it. It may not be readily on hand, but yeah, it's critical if you're looking at a building and it's got 30 rentals, but the disclosure certainly allows for 100% rentals. Then
Exactly.
the dynamics of the building may be very different in weeks or months, years to come.
You're president of Key Pacific, Dan. How does a building that's, say, for example, the majority of occupants of whom are renters, how does, as a property management company, how does that affect your dealing with that strata council and administering that building?
Well, you certainly handle everything in the same way. I mean, it's critical that the tenants that are in there have done an undertaking. We call it a Form K undertaking, which means that they understand the rules, the regulations, the bylaws. They really are stepping in the shoes of the owners.
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, their degree of compliance is the same as any owner. So that's the first thing. And so from our perspective, we're really dealing with the issues of the building and anyone who's has an infraction on bylaws, and the tenant is going to be responsible for that. The fallback, of course, is always going to be the landlord. So I mean, the landlord has to make sure he's vetting that has good people.
Right. Now, Barrett, I wanted to ask you just further to that. If I'm a tenant and I let the bathtub overflow and create water problems to the people below me, and I know Tony and I have covered this in previous programs with insurance guys in studio, but so who's responsible then for the damage caused by that tenant's creation of the water problem? The tenant or the owner of the unit?
And that can certainly be a loaded question on so many levels. But ultimately, the tenant is, first of all, responsible for the act of what...
Because they were negligent,
yes.
Right, okay.
But it obviously, again, also a fallback on the owner. So it's if you have a tenant in a unit talking about insurance, I mean, there is really three insurances on that unit. It's the Strata Corporation.
Right.
It's the homeowner or the landlord.
Right.
And then the tenant.
The tenant should have his or her own
Absolutely.
insurance package.
Absolutely.
Right. So between the three, Tony, somehow or another, the check gets cut and the damage gets fixed.
Well, absolutely, and that's one of the reasons why we have a Form K. Like the bylaws of the Strata Corporation, you're going to occasionally see bylaws that don't necessarily require an enforcement level. And one of the bylaws we'll see is about insurance, whereby it's detailed what type of insurance an owner and a tenant should have.
Right.
The Strata can't force it, but it's articulated in the bylaws the types of insurance the owner and the tenants should have. So when the tenant receives and signs the Form K and they get a copy of the bylaws, it's their obligation to read them now. If they didn't buy insurance for their personal risks and their personal contents,
then they're on the hook.
They're on the hook.
Right.
It's really about disclosure, but it's not about disclosure that is in a negative sense. It's about positive disclosure in the sense that we're telling you how to protect yourself, right? We're telling you how to protect your assets and protect your liabilities.
Okay.
And it's important people realize tenancies are also formed by you could interpret as roommates being a tenant. I mean, a lot of homeowners will say, "Oh, I live here. This is just a roommate." Well, you've created a tenancy agreement there too. So, it's important to keep that in mind. Families can create tenancies, hardships create tenancies, and roommates. Homestay is creating a tenancy. And we have all those undertakings that need to be considered.
So if you have a two-bedroom, for example, and you're a solo-type person, and you've got a friend who wants to rent the second bedroom, that person is your tenant now, right?
I believe you created a tenancy there.
You may have created a tenancy, but it might not be a tenant under the bylaws.
Okay.
The bylaws are all different, and it depends on whether the Strata Corporation is going to deem that part or all of or part of the strata lot is.
But don't call it a roommate and then never be there.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. You'll get in trouble over that big time.
Okay, so again, if you're in a situation where you have a two-bedroom and you're trying to mitigate costs and maybe would consider having that second bedroom occupied by something other than your computer to help defray some costs, then you're going to enter into some kind of financial relationship, and that person coming to occupy that second bedroom, Dan, has got to read the bylaws. They've got to know what they're getting themselves into. It's not just, hey, I'll hang out here for a couple of months
Absolutely.
and see what happens.
And this is the critical thing when you're trying to restrict rentals. The thought process that you're going to go through for this bylaw is important. I'm sure Tony and Barrett, we've all seen bylaws that say the maximum number of rentals is 10.
Yes.
That's only the beginning of the bylaw. There's really so much more to consider in the administration of it and how you're going to define it. And that's why you get into problems down the road. So it's important that there's a lot of thought process goes in here. And there may be even points where you can't have a bylaw restriction.
Barrett, what happens, though, in one of these buildings in which there are 100% renters, even though it's a strata and each individual unit is owned by someone or perhaps an investment syndicate, whatever, but every occupant of that building is a renter. How does that change the dynamic, for example, from a property management perspective?
Well, it can, first of all, because at each annual general meeting, you elect a council. who will be the one that we as a managing agent take the direction from throughout that fiscal year. And sometimes it is a challenge to find, absentee owners
To run for council?
to wanting to run for council.
Because tenants can't, can they?
Yes, they can.
Oh, okay.
In certain exemptions, for instance, long-term tenants that has a lease longer than 3 years can. Family members. But that aside, that could be one of our challenges, is to actually get a council formed so we have someone to take direction from.
Is this a problem, Tony? Do you run across this at the homeowners association there?
Attrition on strata council is a problem at the best of times,
Right.
and then it's compounded with the fact that you have an investment certificate that owns 70% of the units in the building, and
nobody
consortium,
particularly interested in going to strata meetings.
They may not even be resident in the country other than an agent,
Right.
And so you actually have a very small percentage of the owners who are living there who are picking up the load of managing the property on their behalf. So that certainly can be a bit of a challenge. The other side of it, though, is landlords, if they actually have a tenant, and landlords love tenants who are prepared to stay for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, because it's a great investment and it's a great relationship for both. The landlord, whether it's a 3-year or a 1-year assignment, the landlord can give you a written assignment to represent them on strata council.
Oh, I see.
So if the
A proxy, mostly.
So as an
Okay.
owner, if I find it's not a proxy, it's actually a written assignment.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Proxy is a different word.
Okay. Well, no, and it's important to get it out on the table because there's a lot of confusion in terms of terminology within this whole
Absolutely.
industry, and sometimes people just end up being confused and walk away.
Absolutely.
It's just too much for me. Why bother with all that? I'll go somewhere else.
No, it's a written assignment. I'm actually assigning my rights as an owner of a strata lot to my tenant
To
so
represent me
they
on
can
council.
be elected to and represent represent the strata corporation
Right.
on the strata council. So so strata corporations can look at those relationships. Stratas also expand bylaws. They change their bylaws to allow different types of persons to be on strata council.
Okay.
So it helps to fill in some of the gaps, but it's a challenge when you have a significant number of investors who aren't prepared to take an interest in their property.
This is Key Pacific's Talk About Strata here on AM 650. Our guests from Key Pacific, no less,
Hooray.
President Dan O'Hearn and Vice President Barrett Hansen. My co-host is Tony Juventu, Executive Director of the Condominium Homeowners Association of British Columbia. Outstanding website, by the way, for those, especially those first-time would-be condo buyers. Tons of terrific information on their website, which is CHOA or choa.bc.ca. Lots more to come on this edition of the program. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Delivering relevant and beneficial consumer information. This is Experts on Call. And there's more still ahead on AM 650.